Hello, everyone. Good evening and welcome to IFA's Project Showcase. As some of you know, India Foundation for the Arts is an independent not-for-profit that supports and implements projects under research, practice, and education. In the last 27 years, we've supported over 750 projects across languages, disciplines, and in various regions in the country, the outcomes of which are in the public sphere as films, exhibitions, performances, publications, and more. What IFA also is committed to doing, aside from implementing projects, is sharing these works through events such as these that can encourage dialogue, conversations about artistic processes and the creative journeys of artists. Before the pandemic, IFA used to organize these project showcases across the country, collaborating with organizations and collectives in different cities. But now we also have this online version. And today we are happy to showcase a project from our arts practice program with ISH-S. But before we begin, a few house rules. For those of you who are here on Zoom, there's the chat feature, as you know. We'll be sharing a few resources in the chat section. If you have comments or feedback, please put them there. At the end of the presentation, we will have a Q&A section. So if you have any questions for Ish or IFA, please put them in the Q&A. And for those of you who are on Facebook, if you have questions, do put them in the comments and we will bring them into Zoom and ask Ish as well. So I'd like to introduce John Xaviers, Program Officer, Arts Practice, who will introduce Ish and the project that he's going to showcase today.
Thank you, Menaka, for such a warm welcome. My name is John Xaviers and I look after Arts Practice Program along with Sumana Chandrasekhar, who's my colleague. And IFA's Arts Practice Program is about implementing projects in which artists expand their present range of practices by pushing the boundaries of form, content, and medium. So today you will hear from one of the artists, Ish Shehrawat, known as Ish-S, who is a Delhi-based contemporary artist who works with sound art and installation form. Ish has participated in the Yokohama Triennale that was curated by Raqs Media Collective. And Ish will speak about his IFA-supported project called An Octagon and a Square, which is a sound installation based on research on classical music and topologies of geometry. That was shown at 5 million incidents as well as Yokohama Triennale. So it's over to you, Ish, to start speaking about your project.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Around 2018, I had installed my works in Korean Center, and we had planned the installations. There were quite a few installations we did. We did some work as preliminary to the festival that we organized called the Sound Reasons Festival. And during these sort of prelude events, I was uninstalling some of my works, and there was a guard who was working there on the gate of the Korean Center, and he came in and he was like, I'd seen him earlier within the installation because the installation was up for a few days. And he started to put the, he was helping me uninstall the works and put the speakers back into the boxes and everything else. And we started a conversation. He started talking about the installation, and it was really funny because what actually happens is, like, you're working so extensively on the installation part and fine tuning, and then you really miss out on the phenomenology. So at this point of time, I put up some installations which were like older, like, you know, which I made around 2012. And through this conversation, I was able to realize like how deep his listening process was, you know. And this guard, like, you know, I'm forgetting his first name. I think it was Satish Mishra. And he started talking about the edges of the installation, you know. So I was trying to make, if you had the scene on the poster of the installation, like there are these set of speakers that are kept, and on the floor, and this was just the opposite way around. Like the speakers were around you, and the sound sort of made a sculpture around you. And on the edges, I was trying to make in this installation, which was sort of incomplete. And the sound opens up and it closes. And, you know, I had forgotten about this because this was like around 4 or 5 years or 6 years before this installation. And this guy, the guard, he was very specific in telling me that, you know, this phenomenon of the sound is happening within the installation. And it was when he told me about this process, and I had completely forgotten. I didn't even hear it because I was not in the edges. And this was coming from this whole concept at that point of time, which I almost touched. And I went into this whole concept again later on in my works in 2015. And I was developing it from 2010 onwards. And how layered this whole concept was. And it came from this concept of a sonic horizon, where a listening can be heard from the outside and the inside. And how sharp his listening was to pick it up, because if you would just go straight away into the installation, you would probably not hear it properly, you know, and you would be bang in the center and there is something else happening in the center. So this whole concept of what becomes the outside of the installation and the inside of the installation became a place to exchange of originary in a way. Originary is a word which was Deleuze was quoting in cinema also, that that there's an originary world always happening, and how do you sort of tap into this originary world? And he started talking about concepts and listening perspectives, which I had in my mind. I was writing them down, but he was phrasing them in such brilliant ways that I could almost, you know, it was better than anyone else. You know, this guard in his phenomenological understanding of the installation, which I was trying to put forward, was so much to the point that it was even better than mine. And so this sort of understanding becomes the core of my work always, like it always had been the core of my works. And especially to prepare again for this talk, because every time I was writing about it was, and this is how writing about it and talking about it also changes the perspective. While I was writing about it, I became more and more objective, because the reduction into language, into words, what came on paper, and the topology of like sentences and the formation of sentences on a paper becomes totally different. So, so please bear with me sometimes if I'm jumping concepts here. So coming back into the sonic phenomenon became, so this listening became the center. And even though the installations were somewhat like let's say they are technical, like most, they are very, very technical to make. But you know, if I would start talking about the technicality of the installations and, like, you know, what I was using and the sound synthesis and the spatialization, the software, it will just become too technical. So, you know, at some points of time, I will mention it, like here, because that will require something completely different, you know, a perspective to come back to it, and it becomes another sort of a talk, just that aspect. So I would sort of try and avoid it right now, and so this octagon and the square as an installation became another starting point for me, so to speak, to engage with Indian classical music. And this was very important because around, like, well, let's say around 2000, 2001, 2002, I started to, you know, like, I'm an autodidact. So I started to engage with Indian classical music. There were quite a few of my friends who were always engaged with classical music and dance. And so, you know, I could exchange ideas of what we were listening and what was happening. And I was always fascinated by the aspect of improvisation, because at that point of time, I was learning Western classical music, which was like exactly the opposite of it, like of improvisation, and where you had to play a set of, you know, sheet music, which was notated, and and there was a shape to the whole thing which you had to follow. And Indian classical music, especially the alap format, opened up this whole thing of improvisation and how to engage just with the notes. And for me, it was actually minimalism way before, like, the North American movement of minimalism, which was like Cage and Steve Reich and Philip Glass, who were engaging in the music aspect in the 60s and the 70s. And I sort of love the concepts of Indian classical music and how notes are removed and how the sounding of it is within the notes. And you know, they were obviously mood oriented and everything, but I found a lot of other material within the notes of the Indian classical music, which I was exploring. There was one set way of doing it, and you know, and the music is so deep that you really cannot just go into a format and start talking about it and make sense about it, because it has to be engaged, and it comes with a period of time. You know, your first time when I engaged was from playing it, and then there was an understanding of it. The same sort of understanding happens within this installation also, because you have to come back and rehear everything again. So there's a spatial aspect to my installation, which I talked to you about, like this guard from the Korean Center. He was getting all these details because his listening was way sharper than any other person or artist or curator who came and heard the installations. And it was curiously always there in him. You know, it wasn't something that was acquired over a period of time, because the installation was just there for like a couple of days, and he was telling me such deep aspects from just 2 hearings of the installation. So this comes back to what Hasril was saying, like how phenomenology has to be taught, how perspective or seeing is taught to a painter while he's in an art school. And so coming back to the octagon and a square, if John can show the first slide of the PDF,
Sure. Sharing.
And so this sort of becomes the starting point, you know. So the first image that you see is the square and the octagon around it, and you know, if you scroll a little bit, the second image is from another installation I made in Malmo last year. But, you know, you can see the movement of the people. You know, people would come and sit within the installation. This installation is 2 squares. But I wanted to show you how the body interacts with the installation and how it moves around, you know, and how moving around and even if you're in a perspective within the installation, and if you just stand and turn, you know, 20 degrees, the whole perspective of the installation changes. So for me, like if you look at these 2 squares, this sort of became a canvas, you know, where even the outside was a listing, inside was a listing, moving around was a listing, and so-called there was a heterogeneous sort of layered perspectives happening everywhere, where the sound sometimes was traveling in a line, in a curve, in circles, in depth parabolas, and intersecting. So the listening became an important point where there was there was always an intersection of sounds, and these sounds in octagon and the square became the notes of a scale, which were synthesized through synthesis processes, you know, like subtractive synthesis, granular synthesis, and other electroacoustic processes. And if you go to the next image, then there was this thing that was happening. If I didn't tell people to move, they would just come and just sit down and close their eyes. This is again from another installation. And what was happening is like this deeper listening processes were evoked, and they were only possible to be understood as also a reduction. They had to be felt and sort of developed into the listening itself. So that's why, like, the word originary sort of becomes important, like from Delaware's side, rather than the imaginary, which comes from an image. And so the originary starts again in front of you, you know. So coming to the concepts of clearing, which was used in philosophy, Heidegger used it. So there's a clearing from which this listing sort of originates again, and it's in the present. It's something which pushes you forward into it, and it can take you back into the listing of it while you sit down. So the installation sort of became an important point for you to come back into it over a period of days, or like, you know, to re-engage with. So there was nothing complete. Me, after, even when I made the installations, it sort of took, let's say, I could hear, like, like I would have heard it like 300 or 200 times while making it and like putting it together. But, every time I came back into the installations, I could hear something else happening, because your perspectives and where you were standing and the motion and where you sat down became different. And there was always an intersection. So in Octagon and the Square, I was actually engaging on how the notes, if you go to the previous image again, the one before it, the second one, so it became a sort of curved images, a curved motion of sound within this geometrical formation of the installation, and then this was sort of developed from like what I was saying, the Raqs concept, like the essence is, I'm trying to go to the essence of listening itself, and the uniqueness of Indian classical system like helped me out for understanding, because the ragas that I was engaging were pentatonics. There were 5 tones, and mostly they're heptatonic, like there's 7 tones, the scale is 7 tone. And the whole concept of pentatonic, and it becomes ansampurn, so they're sort of unbalanced, but this unbalanced aspect of the ragas convert them into a deeper aspect of listening itself. So I could engage with these concepts, come up with the intervals, so there is the first note sa, and there is pa, and there is re, the first note, and the second note becomes re. And I could spatialize these gaps within the installation and have sort of a movement across them, and then layer it, move it to the side, move it across the installation, have intersections. So that became a sort of way of engaging for me, and a learning process, most importantly, and how I would move away from the performance aspect and go into the spatial aspect of the installations, where it could be spread out. You could be outside the installation, and if you see there are people standing outside the installations and hearing, and perceiving and hearing and listening to the works. So if you go to the next image, to the next page, the one after this. So this sort of became a perspective of the movement, of the sound, of like how I was imagining. This is from my earlier installations, but this was again the concept that I was moving around, like what is happening in the installation, and how important it sort of becomes that that there's a sitting process and then there's a moving process. And this sort of became, for me, these are known as graphical notations and all. I was thinking of making some works just based on graphical notations and playing it live, but this will come as a practice later on. But I was only able to engage with it in the studio. I have not done it much as a live performance, only at MMB in Delhi, I was able to do this. And so coming back to, how this thing was sort of becoming a concept that I was engaging in a live concept, also of playing live music. Now, just before the video, I would love to just show you the scale of Octagon and a square. Then we can go on to see the video. And so okay, I'll just talk a little bit about the last image also. So the last image was how I would use the canvas, and I would divide the canvas into triangles, and canvas becoming the layout of the speakers on the floor. And that too became an important concept for me, because I was able to divide the space into various zones very easily, while keeping the speakers down, and now it's like a very important part of my aesthetic of working, because I don't see any other way of doing it now. You change the format. Technically, it changes a lot what you do with sound from how you create it and how it comes back into the installation. It changes a lot of aspects. It's all layered there, but it's just a technical concept, you know. It's like, but the listing sort of becomes within the shapes that you draw, more shapes, geometrical shapes within the canvas of the speakers on the floor. And then you derive the second last image, the one just before this one. Then you derive this sort of a listing on top of the layer of the installation, which is the image before this one, of people, two images before. Which becomes of the momentum of the people within the installation, and just to keep in track of the momentum of the people in the installation, I was keeping like these sort of directions on the floor, keep saying like step in, take 2 steps to your right, and turn 90 degrees, so that, you know, people start engaging with the installations. Otherwise, they would just sit down and go into this deeper listing. And you know, all these aspects became the important part of the installation. That's why like this multiple interaction and listing of the installation was the main part within the installation. I have made quite a bit of other works, and just with this set of notes that I use in this very specific installation, there are at least 3 more works. And let's say the material that I have right now itself, it will require at least, you know, at least like 8 or 9 more installations to works that have to be put together, you know, in different spaces. So you know, like perfect spaces would be not too big spaces. So if you are from Delhi, so you know, something like Vadera Art Gallery or something which has comparatively smaller spaces, but you can put up different works in different spaces and have this sort of a reflection of each other in different rooms. And this becomes a very important part of the installation, that they're not set up, they're not actually conceptualized, and the phenomenological part of the installations don't fall under a concept that these installations have to be singular, you know. But the perception is of having these works in sort of multiplicity. So so I will just tell you a bit more, because then we can just go into the questions and all. So
Ish, before you play the instrument, shall I stop sharing so that people can see you playing?
Yeah, and then, you know, after this, we can just show the
video. Sure,
yeah.
sure. Yes.
So the scale is sort of a midnight scale and like early morning. That's because the Tivra Ma, like so it's got a augmented fourth through the harmony side or a flat fifth through the melodic side. Again, this becomes a different talk altogether because I can't engage with this part with much depth. But it's very unique to Indian classical music. I was told that this was there in Oriental music, obviously, like in Java or it could be there in the Chinese tradition also. But China being in like an empire-oriented culture. Like each empire sets up its own parameters and it sort of like lost its performance aspect over a period of time. But the scale is a midnight one, and if you hear it, it sort of has this depth, which the exclusion of the fifth, which sort of signifies the sun in Indian classical music. And just because it's a midnight one doesn't have the sun, so it has an augmented fourth, which is a Tivra Ma, and it's sort of introverted also, like So I'll just play you the notes, and then we can hear it in the installation.
Thank you, Ish. Shall we show the film now before you conclude your talk? Please let me know if you're able to hear the sound.
you know, like I was saying, there was always a discovery, like within the works, and I sort of liked the way you could hear an intersection of notes and various harmonies could originate, and you could sort of remove notes, come back to something else, and then add another layer of notes through, and you could explore this through different synthesis, or you could explore it through different electroacoustic processes, and 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 just to come towards the end, because I was also sort of curating a festival called Sound Reasons Festival. Uh, um, uh, so apart from the creative aspect, where I really did not see a sort of difference between what was happening in music to what was transferring to the installation, and I love that I could explore this into this installation, and curatorially, this will sort of move into another, let's say, another dimension, another level. This has to go into another aspect where the whole thing of like exactitude of knowing is actually defeating the way the works are to be perceived, and in the true sense, like Cartesian or any other dialogue sort of becomes totally reductive in this sort of works, and the way the curatorial aspect is sort of set up now, and the creative aspect of territory of concepts and curation, and so, so to speak, tracing of the past, and having a creative and a curatorial approach of an appendix to an event or identity, or a territory laid down by some sort of ghettoization, like, from the inside, becomes completely redundant, and goes into a sort of a negative analysis of what can works be. And this is where I see sound art as a medium being totally different from any other medium, because the image is thrown out, is the first thing that is thrown out. And the territory which is laid down by concepts is thrown out because it becomes reductive. And I could see that in this installation, that it became more than what it sort of I was creatively expecting out. When I started off, and when I wrote about this whole installation as a concept, and when I was like, oh, this is going to be exactitude, I'm going to get the third note, and then I'm going to get the seventh, then the augmented fourth will come, and it will become, all those things were out of the window. You had to sit with it, with the medium itself, and sort of make it, and became like this whole thing of like, what you are trying to see from before is not there in the work, and like, so I would just like to end it with this thing, because a friend was telling me a story, like in early 1990s or something, or mid 1990s, there was a big commission to study the works of Cézanne, and like, he's been coined by everyone, from Picasso to everyone, from the expressionists as the main so-called flagship of the movement. And in the second part of his career, I think he moved away from Paris, and because he was well off, he was staying in his in the countryside, and then he painted a lot of pine trees, if I'm not mistaken. So as any other art academic or art historians would go, so they were trying to find what he was painting, like just the way Van Gogh's bridges and the cafes and stuff they had located. And there was a real location they were trying to find. And when they went to his estate and they were trying to find the trees he was painting, and there were none, So there was none because he was not doing that. He was painting what was coming in front of him, and Shalome Wilgen, I think she was quoting something of being honey is a concept like of becoming the work, and the listing sort of evokes that, So not finding Cézanne's trees was a success for. Was a failure for the whole project, but as a starting point. But it was funny to see it because he was never engaging with his works like that. The imperfections were drawn in the work, which became part of the work. And so in this, the listing and the exactitude that I had, or with what I thought that I will hear before, was immediately thrown out of the window the moment I started engaging with the work. And that's where sound art is at, So the improvisation, the alap, the concept, the Raqs concept, and the way the works can be built up again in the originary, in the clearing of the human experience. And I think that is the creative aspect rather than the art and the articulation and the artifact of it being as the appendix of something else. So for me, it becomes an important point of where I take it forward. Like I was saying, it will have to come into the concept of it being a multidimensional, where it can be layered with other works, and like 6 or 7 works can be shown together. That would be like optimum for these installations to bring forward what I'm trying to do as an artist.
Thank you, Ish, for such a lucid talk. You have touched upon extremely abstract concepts, and the way that you have narrated it, your special ability to unpack and simplify concepts that are quite deep. So thank you so much for such a lucid talk, and thank you for playing the guitar and demonstrating what it means to the pentatonic, the raga, and the omission of pa, which has a major impact in the geometry and the numbers that the installation that you put up. So we have around 15 minutes for Q&A, and I would like to start the conversation with something that you entered with, which is that of the irrelevance of the Cartesian optics when the sound enters. So in a way, contemporary art has a tendency to privilege the visual, and when you introduce the sound, it's in a way the primacy of perception, to quote Merleau-Ponty, that is being dethroned. Would you like to? So, if since you are also quoting Deleuze as for imaginary, and if we look at perception and the cognition as the real and imaginary and symbolic, and something special about sound is its ability to notate the real rather than the imaginary and the symbolic. So would you like to share your worldview about the sound and the real with a capital R?
Yeah.
Okay.
So for us, a real becomes, image is also a real, you know. So, so a photograph is also a real. And so with sound, what happens is, like, if there is a sounding of a clap or a sounding of a bowl or a Tibetan bowl or of a guitar, it sort of leaves that space and then it becomes real in the perception of it, which is there with the image also. But image already has an impact, you know. With sound, it removes completely from the object and it becomes another, you know, I don't have a better word for it. It becomes another medium, you know, it becomes another object that is perceived again through us, you know. So that's why, like, the image and the imaginary, sort of the etymology sort of goes out. So where I found Deleuze important was in the originary concept, in which Heidegger also sort of engaged with it, was clearing out in front of you from where the Dasein is derived, you know. So his originary, even Heidegger said, that is not of the past, which conceptually, curatorially, in curation is pushed forward from the contemporary concept. It's like we trace something, like documentars and everything. It traces something of a historic concept. So so the history. So I see creation not as an appendix to all this, you know. I see creation as a creation through clearing of what is in front of you, and that's where you create. Because if you keep on tracing the past, you're tracing the errors too, you know. And sometimes it's just the tracing of the errors that becomes more important in the conceptual framework of contemporary art, that you will be tracing just the errors. And that's where I found, like, sound and improvisation totally, you know. So that's where the alap, improvisation, sound art sort of overlaps for me, you know, just as an important perspective as an artist, because it's very important, like, art becomes personalized also, rather than an interpretation of things, you know. It doesn't become a signified landscape of, you know, interpreting whatever happened in the past and whatever is the human experience. So even if you see at ragas, you know, ragas are also shown, like, you know, there is ragmala and there are paintings and there are also emotion based on ragas, you know. And for me, just because I was an outsider to all this, and my sort of not knowing the concepts properly also led me to other places of harmonizing of scales, which I think we can also talk about later if we do some other thing. So the whole thing of, like, harmonizing of scales from the Indian perspective and applying other processes to it became an important part. But coming back to the thing, so that's why I like the differentiation of originary and imaginary, you know, sort of played very well against each other.
Mhm. Thank you, Ish. There's a question from Anand Sachin, who's provoked, who's asking, Eisenstein, in elaborating vertical montage, expands on how sound is parallel with image. So can we really separate the ontology of image and sound in a phenomenological audiovisual experience? To
Yeah,
Anand,
yeah. I think he's coming more from the filmmaking side.
yeah, it's from
Yeah.
Eisenstein.
Yeah. So that's what, like, your first step into sound art is to remove the filmmaking aspect of it.
But philosophically, can we separate the sound from the image? As in, when we refer to sound as meaning and sound image as a signifier.
So
So,
meaning is also a reduction, because you will have to fall into language, and language will fall into words. So everything becomes a reduction. So it's important for us to talk about it, because language is the first thing that we talk about. So that's why, like, it became important when I started writing about it. I'd written so much about it, and the way the text falls into a page, and the way you think and talk are two important things. The body comes into the talking aspect. And when I, for a few minutes, I just recorded last night because I wanted to hear myself, because I don't know how I sound. I sound okay through a mic. Sometimes my nose is blocked, so I'm just trying to see if it's blocked, because all these exercises I could see like people do it in theater, how to get your vocal cords open up. And all these smaller aspects of being the human affects everything. Like, you being able to voice yourself and not be constantly corrected by the outside. Oh, this is politically incorrect to talk, or it's not, because that's the aspect of the human being. Like, I'm forgetting his name. So this guy used to say, like, every conversation we had, Zizek used to say, like, we used to start with abusing the other guy, to make a joke on his race or where he was coming from, because they were completely mixed, like Indians, like the Slavic side from where he was from. And that sort of opened up into just because now you've gotten rid of everything else, like what you had to say bad about the other person, then you could go into some other concept of talking good about the other person. So all these aspects are part of the human being, and that's why, like, I see sound itself, like the vocalization, is the most human part. That's why, like, in Hindustani classical or in Indian classical, singing is the topmost part. There is nothing close to singing, So sarangi, which is sarang, 100 colors, it's, if you look at it in hierarchical way, it's like that 18 stories empty after singing, and then all these things come in, like the tabla and the percussion, because we are vocals, so the moment the vocal comes in, even in the technical aspect of music making, mixing, and everything else goes out. Once you put vocals are the center, and human beings, like, there's a technique, there's a triangular technique in mixing, so-called, of music when you sit down. So the moment vocal comes in, it just becomes like the center, the top pyramid, which contains 3/4 of the pyramid, and everything else goes around it. And so that's why, like, the sound itself and comes under a different parameter of the visual.
Ish, there are some other questions as well, which we will get to. Dipesh Pandya has a number of questions, but I wanted to ask you a space question, because you mentioned gallery spaces, and you've shown primarily in gallery spaces as well. And you mentioned small gallery spaces is what you prefer. I'm just curious, have you thought of or conceived, or is there a desire to work in spaces outside of the galleries, or is the gallery space where you want to be?
Yeah, gallery space becomes sort of important, because these are all, like, there's some sort of exactitude, because there's a lot of exactitude of making it. There is a lot of the technical part of it, and then the installation part of it becomes completely different. So this I could only perceive while the installation space became a very, very important tool itself, the space. So the gallery is also a word I'm using. It could be someone's house, like, how Jorbag, 24 Jorbag, the offset space happens. So it's a big house, and there are different spaces. So that would fit perfectly, because there are two aspects. First is, like, tuning the room, it becomes easier. Second, for these works, like the works that I heard, I already have like 4 other counterparts, like cousins of this installation, which can come up. And so the smaller spaces become easier to tune up and make them more presentable. But like you said, these can be in public spaces also. because the person who has the hearing, like the guard from the Korean center, becomes the part. And you know, there could be some sort of instruction, someone just comes up and points it out, you know. It's like this person who just you know, comes up and starts staring at the sky, and then people start staring at the sky. So this whole sociological aspect of groups can be fine-tuned into the hearing. So gallery space just doesn't become important. It becomes more exactitude for me to fine-tune. Like, you know, so my anxiety goes out of it, like of the perception of.
Thanks, Ish.
So the question from Dibesh Pante
Yes.
is quite long, so I'll read it out. So Dibesh is saying, thank you for this enriching presentation. I agree leaving the work open for audiences to discover and experience in their own individual ways expands the meaning of the work. I wanted to know if you have previously worked with any motion sensing technology in your installation. Motion sensors.
Yeah.
Is there a reason why you, there are a few more questions which I'll read at once. Is there a reason why you chose to keep the speakers low to the ground for this work? Have you also explored speaker installations on multiple vertical levels from the ground up with relations to your sketches on sound trajectories around a person entering, circulating the space? And he's also asking, what's the duration of this work? So I think three questions. One is that of motion sensors, other is the direction and the location of the speakers, and thirdly about duration.
Yeah. So motion sensors, you know, I thought it was much more of a gimmick till now. Like, you know, I think a lot of new media art is just like a bombastic presentation of the technicity of the work itself. It's not a work, it's just a glorified presentation of the technical aspect. I've never seen any depth. So so motion sensor was like, you are the motion sensor, your body, you know. And if you move, like if the images that I was showing before, if the audience was given a chair to sit down, they would not move at all. And if they were not given chairs to sit down, they would move around the installation. And there are two very different works in those two images. It's not even the octagon and the square. So for me, when I was engaging with motion sensors, was like you going into details about which number brush you would use in a painting, you know, and is it a 7 number or is it a flat 10 number brush, which doesn't make a difference, you know. It's human beings, the experience, the art making, the creative experience is much more like bigger than the technical aspects of sensors. And like, you know, even the interpretation of data, when people are saying AI, I'm more interested how AI replaces the artists completely rather than artists using AI, you know. Like, you know, there's a whole redundant way of the way people are seeing as algorithmic and machine learning. You know, it's a statistical concept. People have still not understood, like, you know, the way the people, it's some, you know, it's another discussion. Like people, when there's coming back into the technical aspect of like, even like very briefly, I'll just touch on AI, is also like how people are looking at it. They're just into like, it's like you seeing an aircraft and you've never seen an aircraft and you say, oh, I've seen wheels, so this will get me to the next street, is the understanding of AI right now, you know. And this is a space shuttle you're looking at, you know. So, and you're thinking, you know, you can go shop for some eggs and come back home. And so right now, like, and the same with motion sensing, you know, it's good to play video games with it in tennis or something and shoot a bird in the sky. But I really don't see motion sensing. It has to come up with a broader concept of how it translates. And for me, I already have so much other things that I've explored with it. And the way, so coming back to the other question of like, can it be installed outside, was the aspect of like the human body becomes a sort of an engagement again with the work. And for me, the instructions to the body and the phenomenology became a core. Like just for me, I'm not saying from the outside, all this stuff that I'm talking is from my perspective, and everywhere I went while traveling also, I was going and seeing works because I love that, like listening to people talk about their works and seeing other works. And the other works sort of never translated, you know, even when they were technically at the topmost level, like IRCAM and ZKM and all. So I was just seeing them as glorified demos, basically, you know, motion sensing and, you know, they were just demos of a technology done by artists in a gallery space, you know. And yeah, and the duration of the work of Octagon and a Square, the second part that I put up in Yokohama was around 1 hour, 10 minutes or 1.5 hours. The first one, which I put up in MMB, was around 50 minutes, 55 minutes. And that too also became sort of redundant, because the moment you would shift 30 degrees to your right, the work will be different. It will be completely different. And you walk somewhere else and you go stand outside. So there were instructions on the floor for people to engage with it differently. And then that's why, like, I was not looking. So the installation part for me is totally different from the making part. So it keeps on changing shape till I reach the end part. Like how I was saying, in Cezanne, even the imperfections were part of the work, you know, were part, like there's a lot of perspective. So if you look at a still life of Van Gogh and still life of Cezanne, you know, they sort of look similar, but they are totally different from each other also. There's more imperfection that you see in the first sight in this Van Gogh's painting, but there are way more imperfection and perspectives in Cezanne's painting.
There's one comment or question from Facebook. This is from Tenzin Gopal. And I'm not sure, Ish, if you engage with sonic documentation, but he's saying that they're currently working with sonic visual art, and is curious about your views on how sonic documentation of, say, climate or environmental changes can be different from visual documentation.
Okay, sonic documentation of environment, like
environmental or climate change, say, for example.
Yeah. Because they can be different, because they can be like, you know, some people have recordings of some species that are disappearing, and yeah, it can be different from the visual documentation, but the artistic so how the data will be interpreted sonically, that will make no sense for the human beings. Let's say that, you know, from my perspective, you know, I'm not coming up like saying, you know, that, but I would think it would be like completely sort of wrong, because there is intellectual engagement with the data itself, you know, and the more artists get involved, the more it removes from the technical side of it, how the data is supposed to be analyzed by someone else, you know. So just coming to the climate change part, like very briefly, like, you know, so all the climate change like data is like surface data. So imagine like we have kilometers of atmosphere, and we have like an amount of data in the atmosphere of layers, you know, from 1960s onwards, so almost like 40 years of data. And that data becomes very important for it to be just analyzed as data, you know. And the artistic expression is like just like saying, yeah, to like put any color to it, or it will be like Windows 95 screensaver to a song. It's a screensaver to a song, but that screensaver doesn't become Bach. So you putting some sort of artistic abstraction of a data of climate change into sound or visual is a redundant thing altogether, because that's supposed to be a specific scientific way of looking at things. And the very fact that then you do it and becomes part of a dialogue removes the other part, which is the important part, which is scientific statistical data interpretation of it, where people right now, half of the dialogue would be of like surface area temperatures, where we have 40 years of like stratospheric and ionosphere data, which is not interpreted at all, and there are a lot of other things which gets removed. There is again the reduction and how the other part is removed, and frankly speaking, artists are not supposed to do this, there is, you can put it up, it again becomes the whole thing, like it becomes an appendix to something. So you would do it. So it will be a screensaver, a Windows screensaver part, because you would not understand it, first of all. No artist is like strong enough to understand data, So it will just be, and it goes into thin air, and then the next guy comes and does something. So I was never interested in data and interpretation of climate change and this, because it removes other dialogue from it, because the multi-layered dialogue is sort of becomes an important part that it's never interpreted. So all the models are surface layer models, like of ocean temperature and everything, saying that none of the other data matters, like the ocean, the depth of ocean, the temperature of the depth, the 2 kilometers above the ocean, all that data, and everything is low pressure based, because I used to sail, so low pressure builds up the wind pressures, builds up like how the rain patterns fall and everything. So all that data is removed. Imagine like now you're studying why is this water boiling, while you don't even know that there's a fire underneath it and there's a lid on top of it, and you're just seeing the water on top of the kettle, and you're saying, oh, this water is boiling and it's bad, and you're not seeing anything else. So it removes that part, because then artists are given this data and then artists interpret this data, then we see and the very negation part of it is like we are supposed to feel bad about it. We're supposed to earn, we're supposed to put in money, and then the whole thing goes into the climate change. So I don't think so there's interpretation of data directly into this, just like a glorified, sort of abstraction.
There is a question from Urja Garg. So, Menaka, shall we take this as the last question?
Yeah, we'll take this as the last question. Sounds good.
Okay. There's one more question from Tenzin Gobal. I think that we already did that.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll just read out Urja Garg's question as the last
together,
question.
maybe they all fall together.
There's one question, only one more question from Urja Garg. Could you please elaborate on the aspect of an architectural staging becoming an image in itself, and how one navigates the space induces with the two geometrical shapes a visual perception to the soundscape? Also, the process of the installation governing movement of bodies gives the work a performative aspect. Like you said, had there been no chairs, people would have moved around the installation, which makes the image of people sitting still a part of the work.
Yeah.
So the architectural and geometric aspect of the work, as well as the performative aspect of the work.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. Like the question has the answer in it, and so that was the thing. Like every time I was putting up the work, it sounded new to me again, because it has come up in a space, and the space itself sort of gave another life to the work. So just like African music is more rhythmic, because it was not performed in like these big churches. The moment you bring all these percussions, they will just fill up the reverb and everything. So the choral singing and so I'm forgetting the other one. So they could only originate in a church, where the tones could become longer, the reverb and the so-called the echo to reverb effect was longer. And the architecture changed the form of music. There's a very good lecture on this also. One guy online had put up like of piano playing, of organs, like how the organ was a church thing. And imagine like it was the best sounding instrument in the church, And Mézières, this French composer, he was continuously engaged with the organ, and he said like no other instrument fits in with the organ. So he would just be in the evening time. He had taught almost everyone, everyone used to go and study his harmony classes in the 70s and the 60s and all. And he had a special love for the organ, So the architectural space changes the whole thing. And it's really interesting because he says the performative aspect of the installation and the way people move is the most important. So I was working with two dancers who were interpreting this whole thing as a piece. And there are a lot of other video pieces I've made for the installation. I've only shown two. So if you go to Sound Reason's website and you type in Ish, or if you go to the video section, there are a few things you can see, or you can, and it's there on the Facebook page also.
With Aditi Mangaldas, no? There is one with Aditi Mangaldas.
No, that's totally different. Those are totally different pieces because those are choreographed. Those were already choreographed. That's like exactitude. Their works is complete exactitude. So that was music, But I'm just coming back to the visual aspect, like how I was trying to build the architecture of listening and interpreting it in the visual aspect of it. So the works, by becoming layered, were becoming a sculpture, like what I was calling Tarkovsky's, like, I took a bit from him, like I was calling this thing sonic sculpting in space, So the fact that the speakers were on the floor was how I could divide the space even more, rather than speakers being around or in a height, which was asked earlier, which I had done, in my studio. Like in this very room, I put up speakers on top and everything. But for me, it was becoming more of like how I would minimalize my interpretations also. Like, so I could work with other finer aspects of the electroacoustic or the synthesis processes. So when I put it on the floor and I experienced it, I was like, oh, this thing fills up even more. Rather than some gimmicky thing that you're all surrounded by speakers and this, it's all a part of the medium, But I could see the phenomenons and my concepts translate better with the floor thing. And once that happened, like everything changed for me, Like it wasn't that the speakers will be on the top. The fact that the speakers were on the floor changed the whole thing, because suddenly now sound always comes from around you and from the top, If you would close your eyes right now, if you're on a busy street, you can hear a cycle guy and a bell and a dog and a motor running and, everything, and that's what I'm trying to engage with. So the technical aspect for me is not the important part at all. This whole thing of like deeper listening processes that can be evoked through the sound installation. That's why like sound art or as a medium, the image sort of goes out, because image can be reformed again, so that I can show you, again, one example of this is a very good example, is that I can show you an image and you can never imagine the sound. I can make you hear a sound of a place where you've been in, like let's say some market, in Goa or in Kochi or something, and and you've been there, and I tell you, so this is like the market from the outside, and there are the fabric people on the left side, the meat people, and the bangle store, and I tell you to close the eyes. Now you can make up that space. The imaginary is easy, but the originary of the sound is tough. You cannot make up the sound in your head. It's almost impossible. You can hear it, but you cannot make it.
With that note, we wish to conclude. Thank you so much, Ish, for connecting with the audience so well with concepts that are extremely abstract. You simplified it and communicated very well. So before we conclude, I have some announcements. On March 16th, there's a screening of Shahi Ajay's film, Letters Unwritten to Nir Masood. So this will be a physical event in Bangalore, so we'll share more details later. And our next online project showcase will be in March. The dates will be announced on our IFA social media. So please follow us on social media. And once again, please join me in thanking Ish Shehrawat for such a wonderful evening. And on behalf of IFA, I thank all of you to join us today evening. Thank you so much. Thank you, Ish.
Thank you, Ish.
Thank you. Thank you for this.